Listen, let me get this out of the way right off the bat. So I'm guessing there's probably some of you that got the first email yesterday that Mike was coming back, but you didn't get the second email that he wasn't coming back this week. And this is the most disappointing face that you've seen on the stage in a long time. I'm owning it. I get it. It's okay. I did wear a suit jacket in honor of Mike for the very first time in the last 4 months. That's worthy of applause. Thank you so much for that. Just so you know, I'm very uncomfortable. Suits aren't made for short people where like you're as wide as you are tall. It's not the right look. It doesn't look good. Anyway, thanks for being here this morning. So yes, some wonderful news yesterday with Pastor Mike. Hope you guys get a chance to come on Wednesday night. I think it'll be, we got a chance to see him on Friday, and Terry and Joseph and Elise, and it was just a wonderful time to be able to see their faces again. So we're really excited for next week. So hopefully you get a chance to come on Wednesday night too. This morning we're excited to continue on in the series that we've been doing, just looking at some of the different teachings or miracles, healings, all that sort of stuff of Jesus. So if you got a Bible, flip it open to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 is where we're going to be. And as you're flipping there, let me give you just some information. Let me give you some context, some background on the passage. So understanding who Jesus is talking to is actually really critical. Sometimes, and we've looked at this in the past, sometimes when he's giving his teaching, he's talking to large groups of people that many of them don't yet know him. They're sort of deciding if they believe who he says he is and following him. And then at other times, it's more of a smaller, more committed group of people like his 12 disciples. And so actually that's the group that he's talking to in this passage in chapter 25. So this, again, if you were with us a few weeks ago, we looked at the parable that's right after this, the parable of the talents, right? So this is right before that. And this is part of the Olivet Discourse. So we talked about that a couple weeks ago. And essentially what that means is Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, Olivets, on the Mount of Olives, and he was kind of had this small, intimate moment with his disciples, teaching them, and the content of the teaching is the things to come, right? The end of the age, the end times. And so the passage starts out, the sermon, I guess, starts out, Jesus talking about the temple, and he says, and they're like amazed at the temple. He's like, listen, one day's coming when not one stone will be left on another. And so they ask him about it, and that's the sermon that we're in. That's the Olivet Discourse here. And so all of it is about future things. So it's about, things like judgment and the second coming and the rapture, the consummation of Jesus' kingdom. And so the passage that we're looking at is very much in line with that. Our parable today is about Jesus' return, and more specifically, us being prepared, us being ready for his return. And I want to say this too, that I want to help you be in the right frame of mind this morning. So maybe your instinct as we look at this is to immediately think of yourself. Like as we dig into this is a great passage for heart checks for us this week. It's a great passage to look at what the scriptures say and look at our heart and see how they line up. And so maybe for some of us, it affirms where we're at. And for others of us, we're convicted that maybe we've strayed a little bit. Maybe we're not in the right place. And so our instinct, probably for all of us, is to look at our hearts first. And I want to affirm that instinct. I think that's good. But don't just leave it there. So what's critical about what we'll dig into this morning is it's not just about us. So I'm guessing that many of us in this room or many of us watching will listen to this morning, and it will affirm where we're at with God. It will affirm our future, our preparedness for him. But I want to challenge you to take it to another level. I firmly believe, I am convinced that what God does inside of us, showing us who Jesus is, transforming us understanding the gospel, is not just for us, right? It's easy to think about my worship of him and my salvation and my future glory one day. But I really want to challenge you this morning to do the hard work to think about other people. Who has God put in your life? If you are somebody who is his, who is saved, I really encourage you to think, who has God put in your life for you to share this with? Does that make sense? It's critical for us this morning to take that next step. We on the same page? Nod your heads. That makes me know that you're listening. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to jump into it. So Matthew 25, so here's what I want to do. I want to read the passage for us. I want to dig into it a little bit and explain it and help us understand it. And then we'll bring it into the 21st century and we go, well, what do we learn from this? What are our takeaways from this passage? And let me just give you a quick reminder. Whenever, what we've said throughout kind of this last part, this tail end of the Jesus series, as we've been looking at the parables, we said a really good way, a good standard, a good baseline for us in interpreting the parables is to look at each of the main characters, groups of characters, or main objects in the parable and learn something from them, right? Like what should we get from each of the kind of the main parts of the parable, and how do we apply it to our lives? So as we read this, I want you to look for those three things, okay? So here we go, Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 1. So this is Jesus speaking. He says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps, or torches, it could be translated as torches, and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, 'Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'Since there will not be enough for us and you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves.' And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he answered, 'Truly I say to you, I do not know you.'" And then Jesus kind of pulls out of the parable and he says, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." So that's the parable. So in all of Jesus' teaching, he often, it's a masterful way to teach. He often uses imagery that his listeners would have been very well acquainted with, right? So everybody has experienced a wedding, right? If you are an adult, we've all experienced a wedding at some level. And so all of Jesus' listeners 2,000 years ago would have experienced a wedding as well. Last week we talked about a wedding too, right? We looked at the children playing, some playing wedding, some playing funeral. Fortunately, we're just talking about weddings this week. But everyone was familiar with a wedding. And Jesus, what he explains here to our ears may sound a little bit different. Like there's parts of it where we go, that doesn't sound like any wedding that I've ever been to, right? But to his first century listeners, all of this would have been very normal sounding to them. To us, it sounds a little different. Like the use of the word virgins, for example. Like we don't use that. It's in some translation, bridesmaids. Right? We don't use virgins when we talk about wedding ceremonies. But in Jesus' day, people got married much younger. And so shortly after they reached sexual maturity, they were eligible, so to speak, to get married, right? And so obviously still virgins. And so since kids reached sexual maturity in their teenage years, people got married. So the average age of kids getting married was like mid-teenager, 15, 16 years old. Do you know what the minimum age was? I read this week and I almost choked. For boys, 13 years old. For girls, 12. I have a 12-year-old daughter. Marcia and I talked this week. We've decided we're going to wait a few years before we get her married off. We still have a lot of savings for the dowry anyway, so we got some time. Anyway. So in a typical Jewish wedding ceremony, it was customary for the bride to have 10 bridesmaids. So in the parable, there's 10 bridesmaids, right? That was actually very normal for an ancient Jewish wedding ceremony. The bridesmaids were typically the bride's close friends and about the same age as them. And so how it worked was, on the day that the wedding ceremony began, the 10 bridesmaids would go over to the bride's house and they would, spend time together and get all prettied up for a wedding. I've never been a bridesmaid at a wedding, but I imagine you put a dress on and your makeup and your perfume, you get your flowers ready. And so they were over there getting ready, waiting for the bridegroom to arrive. And at some point that day, the bridegroom then would come over and he would pick up the bridal party and they would process to his house, or if he was young, his parents' house. And that initiated a 7-day wedding feast. That's what ancient Jewish weddings were like. And so this was interesting. It was very normal for them to wait for the groom to arrive, like to have to wait. and sometimes wait a little bit longer than expected. And so part of that is they have a different sense of time and punctuality than we do in the West. But part of it, this was interesting as I was reading this week, many times it was because the groom, and I made a joke about a dowry for my daughter, but many times the groom and the bride's family, he was delayed because they were still negotiating the dowry, the bride price, right? And so eventually they come to, we don't exactly know if that's the reason in this parable, but eventually they get that all figured out, and he's late, right? That's the main point, is that he's late in coming. And so eventually day turns into nighttime, and of course they don't have electricity back then, and so they had lamps fueled by oil to keep things lit. And it's unclear exactly what kind of lamps were used here. Some theologians think they're kind of rudimentary versions of like a kerosene camping lamp that we would use, kind of rudimentary versions of that. And in many of the Jewish ceremonies, the bridesmaids would carry those, and they would use those to light the wedding feast. The wedding often went late into the evening, and they would use those lamps that way. Another theologian, this was interesting, so that word can be translated as torches as well, lamps or torches. He talked about how it was customary in ancient Jewish weddings to have the bridesmaids carry I imagine kind of the Indiana Jones looking torches, like on a stick with a, fabric around it dipped in oil and flaming hot. But they would use those and do a dance, a torchlight dance is what they called it, when they got to the wedding ceremony. And those lamps, so they're kind of pole lamps, those lamps were very bright. They burned brightly, and they went through oil really quickly. But whatever the lamp was like, the issue was the groom was delayed, right? The groom's delay caused the problem. And they all probably had enough oil at first. Like when you first read this passage, it sounds like the unwise ones, the foolish ones, didn't bring any oil, period. But likely they would have had enough oil initially, like in the lamp. But they didn't bring enough extra oil in case the man was delayed, the groom was delayed. But 5 of the bridesmaids were well prepared, right? They brought extra oil with them, knowing that the groom could be a long time in coming. And so they were ready if they had to wait longer than they expected. The other 5 weren't. They weren't thoughtful. They weren't prepared in case the groom was delayed. Well, he was delayed, right? He was very delayed. In fact, so long that they fell asleep. This kind of just makes me smile. I'll talk about this here in a few minutes. But they fell asleep waiting for him. And then at some point, word comes that the groom is on his way. And so they quickly wake up. I imagine like pillow marks on their face and drool coming, messing with their makeup. So they get all cleaned up and they grab their lamps, trying to get ready for the march over to the groom's house. But 5 of them very quickly realized that they didn't bring enough oil. It was so late, their lamps had used the oil that they had initially brought. They were running out, and they wouldn't have enough oil for their responsibilities at the wedding feast. The other 5 were good, right? They were well prepared. They brought extra just in case the groom was late. The unprepared, foolish 5 bridesmaids asked the prepared, wise 5 bridesmaids to share their oil with them, right? Could you give us some of your oil? Problem was, there wasn't enough oil for all 10 of them. If the wise bridesmaids shared their oil, what would happen? No one would be able to do their job, right? And so they say, no, you need to go to the dealer and you need to buy your own oil. Remember, it's midnight. And so they got to go out at midnight, wake the dealer up, and buy some oil from them before the groom gets there. So those 5 make like a banana and split. They go looking for oil, right? Looking everywhere and anywhere to find what they need. The groom arrives, though, while those 5 bridesmaids are scrambling for the oil, and they miss him. By the time they get their oil, the bridegroom, the bride, and all the rest of the bridesmaids, the wise bridesmaids, are gone. They went to the wedding feast without them. And so they hightail it over to the groom's house, because better late than never, right? Except not with the groom. That doesn't hold true with the groom. He says to them when they get there, the door's shut. They I guess, knock and ask to come in. And he says to them, strangely, he says, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you." And that sounds weird to our ears, like we would presume that they would know, the groom and the bride would know all 10 of the bridesmaids. But that expression, I say to you, I do not know you. I was reading, it's kind of interesting. It was used between a rabbi and a student when the rabbi was frustrated with the student and he wanted to expel them from class for a week. He would say to them, I do not know you. And they were expelled for a week. We're going to try it with our kids this week when they mess up. I do not know you. I'm looking at my son right now. Anyway, so he doesn't let them in, right? And that expression, I do not know you, I don't know where your mind goes, but I immediately go back to a prior sermon of Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, right? When Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And then people say, but we did all these things for you, Jesus. We did all this stuff for you. And he says, then I'll say to them, I'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. And so at some level, this idea of knowing the groom, the bridegroom, is really important. We'll come back to that here in a little bit. So that's the parable. At the very end of the parable, again, Jesus kind of pulls out of it, and he says, watch, therefore. Watch, be ready, be prepared, for you do not know the day and the hour. Right? So 2,000-ish years ago, Jesus writes that to his church, to his disciples. He tells it to his disciples. He writes it to his church. Now, 2,000 years later, we have to do the hard work of bringing it into our context. Like, what do we do with this? What do we take away from this? How do we apply it to our life? Well, the first thing I would say, again, is we would look for the main characters, groups of characters, or main objects in the parable. And so this one's not too terribly difficult. You have, go ahead, that next slide. You have the bridegroom, you have the wise bridesmaids, and you have the foolish bridesmaids, right? And so the bridegroom, you can go to that next slide there if we're not stuck on it. But the bridegroom, in the past, in the other parables that we've looked at, the authority figure in the parable, we've said, represents God, or God the Father. This one's a little bit different in that the bridegroom, the authority figure in this, represents God the Son, very specifically. This is talking about Jesus here and the return of Jesus. The wise bridesmaids then represent some of us, and the foolish bridesmaids represent others of us. And some of you, maybe like me, are wondering, okay, well, that makes sense, but are there any other main objects in the parable? Like, this is an interesting parable because it's got a lot of objects in there that we may be inclined to go, man, maybe this represents something else too, right? Like, maybe the lamp represents something that we should learn from as well. Maybe the oil represents something that we learn from as well. That's a question that I've asked myself many times this week, and I can tell you after hours of study, here's my answer. Maybe. Maybe. Candidly, I'm just not sure. More of the modern theologians think not. And so they look at this parable and they go, listen, most of the details of this parable were a part of every wedding ceremony that the apostles, that the 12 disciples would have been a part of. It was just a normal part of the story, a normal part of the scenario, right? And if it's a normal part of the scenario, their perspective is that those details are in there just to make the story make sense. Not everything is allegorized. Not everything is representative of a deeper spiritual reality. And so it seems best for us to kind of treat this as another simple three-point parable. Although, I'll be honest with you, I'll press that here in a couple minutes. There's some things that I just feel like maybe there's a little bit deeper meaning to for us, and you can decide if I'm right or not. I feel pretty confident that these three, though, there's some very clear takeaways from this. What do we get from the bridegroom? What do we learn about God the Son from the bridegroom? And then what do we learn about ourselves from the wise and the foolish bridesmaids? So let's start with the bridegroom, who represents God the Son. What do we learn from him? I would say it this way. Jesus' return may be delayed, but he is coming back. Like, what do we learn from the bridegroom, who they're waiting for him, right? He's delayed, he's delayed, he's delayed. But he comes. Eventually, he comes. Jesus' return may be delayed, but he's coming back. Feels like a long time, doesn't it? I mean, it's been over 2,000 years, 2,000 years since Jesus was gone. 2 millennia. Like for context, our country is about 250 years old, our entire country, right? We're talking 2,000 years ago. And like as I think about this, I think most of Jesus' disciples in the early church, they thought that he was coming back immediately. Like they were under the assumption that Jesus would return in their lifetime. And I think part of the reason that Jesus tells this parable is to help us understand he's going to be delayed in coming, right? And so he's 2,000-year delay that we're in right now. And if we're not careful, when we're forced to wait this long, it's easy for us to act and live as if he's not coming back, right? Or at least as if he's not coming back in our lifetime. So we could just kind of go through life and live. We can do our own thing, assuming we have time. There's time. There's plenty of time, right? What's the rush? Jesus has been gone for almost 2,000 years. I doubt he's coming back tomorrow. That can be our perspective, right? And maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Or maybe it's not. You know, one of the things that we believe that's kind of core to our theology as evangelicals is that Jesus' return is imminent. You ever heard that word? Jesus' return is imminent. You know what that means? It means it can happen at any time. It's forthcoming. It's impending. It's just around the corner. There aren't 10 things that need to happen before Jesus can come back. I'm not worried that he's going to come back because these 10 things got to happen first. I'll just watch for these 10 things, and then I'll know he's coming back soon. That's not what we believe. Jesus is really clear. He's going to come like a thief in the night, unexpected, right? In fact, that's what he says at the end. Keep watch. You do not know the time. You do not know the hour. And so we believe that his return is imminent. He's delayed, but he's coming, right? He's delayed 2,000 years, but he's coming. And that should be an encouragement to us. I hope you hear that this morning, and that's an encouragement to you. It's all over the place in the Bible. One of the clearest places is in the book of Revelation. I know Pastor Mike preached on the book of Revelation a few years ago. If I were to summarize it in one little short sentence, here's how I would say it. He's coming back, and he wins. That's the book of Revelation. He's coming back, and he wins, right? It's absolute. It's for sure. Maybe it happens in our lifetime. Maybe it doesn't happen in our lifetime. But the bridegroom is returning to claim his bride and celebrate together the marriage supper of the Lamb. If you haven't read Revelation 19 in a long time, I think it's verses 6 through 8, you should do it. The marriage supper of the Lamb. One day Jesus is going to snatch his church, his bride as we're called, and he's going to take us to be with him and celebrate together in paradise forever and ever. And he's going to make all things new. And he's going to destroy sin and evil and death, and our enemies will be no more, and we're going to get a chance to be with him forever in paradise. And it's a paradise that's better than any paradise you could ever imagine. That's what's coming. He's coming back. He's delayed, but he's coming back. And so I hope that you're encouraged as you hear that. I encourage you this week to take time and think through that. Like, allow your mind to imagine what that will be like. He's coming back. How about the wise bridesmaids? What do we learn from them? Well, I would say it this way. We must be ready and prepared as we wait for Jesus' return or our going to him. We must be ready and prepared as we wait for Jesus' return or our going to him. And as you hear that, I bet all of you are thinking, well, I know that. That's really easy. Like, I got that from the wise bridesmaids. Like, what are we supposed to do? Be ready. What did they do? They were ready for the groom to come, right? They had enough oil. They were prepared to wait if needed, but they were also prepared not to wait if he came immediately. They were ready. And so as you think about that, here's my question for you this morning. What should it look like for us to be ready and prepared like those wise bridesmaids? Like, think about your own life. 2,000-ish years later, what should it look like for you to be ready and prepared, just like those wise bridesmaids? I think of it this way, and this is the point where I think I don't know. I don't think I'm reading into the text too much. I think this is a good application for us. But I look at the bridesmaids, the wise bridesmaids, and I go, well, what did they do in their waiting? How were they prepared, right? Well, they were prepared because they got all prettied up, all ready for the bridegroom to come. They, like we said earlier, got their dress on, they did their makeup, perfume, flowers, all that sort of stuff. They were ready. They had plenty of oil just in case. They had a contingency plan, right, in place just in case. And then how else did they wait? They slept, which just makes me smile. I'll get to that here in a second. There's something there, I think. But I think about the part about being prepared. They were ready for him. They got themselves ready for the marriage, and then they had plenty of oil. And I go, okay, what's the equivalent of that to our lives today? And here's what I think it is. I think it's discipleship. Like, what does it look like for us to be prepared? What does it look like for us to be ready? Well, I think it looks like us being ready for Jesus to come so that he looks at us and he says, that's what I was hoping you would be. That's what I was hoping you would be like. Right? Like, what is discipleship for us? Well, it starts with this. I know him. I love him. That's the foundation. And from there, because of that, I read about him. I spend time with him. I put into practice the things that he teaches, right? I love the way that he loves. I forgive the way that he forgives. I extend mercy and compassion and grace the way that he does. I spend time with the kind of people that Jesus spent time with, that our culture's equivalent to the tax collectors and sinners and Samaritans, the broken, the lost. And I share with them the good news of the gospel. I share with them the hope that I have in Jesus Christ. I think that's what it means to be prepared. I look to be the kind of disciple that Jesus describes his disciples to be here in this book. Does that make sense? I was talking to Marcia yesterday. She's serving up in the kids ministry. I was talking to her. I was sharing a little bit of this stuff with her. And I said, it reminds me of when you and I were getting married. Like, I remember having this mindset. I thought, I want to prepare myself to be the kind of man that Marcia deserves. Right? Like, I want to prepare myself, and whatever these months are leading up to our wedding ceremony, to be the kind of husband that Marcia deserves. Marcia deserves a good man, right? I was talking to her, and she goes, did you really? Like, did you really remember that? I go, yeah. Didn't you have, like, the same thought process, or? She's like, I don't know. But listen, I think about being prepared and ready for Jesus in similar ways. I love him. I want to become the kind of man that he deserves his followers to be like. I want to become the kind of son that he deserves to have, right? We need to become the kind of sons and daughters that God deserves and God desires us to be. So I think discipleship is a huge part of us being prepared. The second thing, and again, the sleep part is just really interesting to me. I fully admit, you take with this what you want. I fully admit, I could be reaching a little bit here, I'm not sure. But I think it's just fascinating that all of the bridesmaids fell asleep, right? It wasn't just the foolish ones who fell asleep. The groom was taking a long time in coming back, and they got tired. And what do you do when you get tired? You take a nap. And in the parable, it was neither good nor bad. It just was, right? It was just like part of being a human being. They were tired, and so they slept. And I think about that, and I think about how much that resembles life for us as we wait for the bridegroom. Like, we just have things that we have to do, right? It's neither good nor bad, it just is. And so we prepare ourselves well. We get all prettied up, so to speak. We have extra oil, so to speak. We're prepared, and then we live life as living, breathing, finite human beings. Like, part of waiting resides in the mundane things of life, doesn't it? Like, it just does. Like, we have responsibilities. We have to sleep. We have to eat. We have to go to the grocery store. We have to take the kids to soccer practice. We have to, pay the bills. We have to go to the DMV. Nobody likes to go to the DMV, but you have to go to the DMV, right? Like, it's part of life. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. The problem is when we let those parts of life keep us from being prepared, right? Like, we can allow the mundane things of life, or even the more important things of life, like relationships with our spouse, with our kids, with our neighbors, whatever. We can allow those things to consume all of us. And if we're not careful in our waiting, we never get prepared. We never get all prettied up for the wedding ceremony. We forgot to get the extra oil. You understand what I'm saying? See, I think if this parable, if all of the virgins, all of the bridesmaids slept that whole time, and they didn't get prepared, this would be a parable about 10 unwise, 10 foolish bridesmaids. Because part of what we're supposed to do is prepare, be ready, discipleship, as we live life, as we wait. I love how Pastor Mike has said it in the past. We wait and we work. We wait. There's stuff that we got to do. And then there's spiritual things that we have to do. We just can't let the stuff of the world distract us from being prepared, from being ready. How about the foolish bridesmaids? Let's end with that. I think this is Jesus' biggest point in this parable. I think this is kind of the main point of the three in this parable. What do we learn from them? Well, to use the words that I used last week, like, this is a whole lot of the bad news of the good news. Right? Like, the gospel, the good news, the gospel has got some really good news to it, and it's got some bad news to it, right? And both of them are essential. This is a lot of the bad news of the gospel. And so what do we learn from them? I'd say it this way. Those that are not ready to meet Jesus at his return or the end of their lives will be shut out of his presence for eternity. Those that are not ready to meet Jesus at his return or the end of their lives will be shut out of his presence for eternity. And it's interesting, even as I read that, it gets real quiet in the room, doesn't it? Like, that makes us uncomfortable, and it should. Can I just, I prayed a lot about, like, how to share this with you guys this morning, and I think maybe the best approach is to just be very direct with it. I think what Jesus is trying to help us get here is that judgment is coming. Right? Like, judgment it's coming, and it's final. Whether Jesus comes back in our lifetime or we go to meet with him, judgment is coming. The question is, are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for that? And only you can answer that. No one can answer that but you. And just to be clear one more time, the way that his judgment is not about looking at the sum total of our life and going, yep, they did enough good things to meet the minimum threshold to be with me for eternity. That's not judgment. It's in no way that. At judgment, the fundamental quality that causes us to measure up, it's threefold. Know him, love him, and submit to him. I know him. I mean, you remember what he says in verse 12. I do not know you. What does he say to the foolish brides? I do not know you. Paramount for us is to know him, love him, and submit to him. He is my master. I lay my life down in submission to him. Everything flows from that. As a Christian, everything flows from that, and everything grows from that. If you get that right, know him, love him, submit to him, then the rest is just a process that God works out, a process of transformation that he works out in our life with our cooperation. But it all starts with us knowing him and loving him and submitting to him. Make no mistake, the Bible is so clear that those that aren't prepared to meet him will face the worst news of the gospel. Like, I don't know, I guess we don't talk about this all that much. But hell is real. Like it talks about it over and over and over and over in here. It's not an allegory. It's real. And what hell is total separation from God. Right? Like I am completely separated from him for eternity. Like just for a minute, allow your mind to imagine what that must be like. Like allow your mind to imagine the misery and the hopelessness of being separated from God and everything that's good forever. And instead of receiving the grace and mercy and forgiveness and love of God, you receive separation, you're treated as his enemy, and we receive the wrath of God. Like just allow your mind to think about that. If you sit here this morning and you go, I don't know that I believe that, Jeff. I don't know that I believe that. Okay. Like you have to decide that. It absolutely says that in here over and over and over again. You have to decide. Do I accept it? Do I believe it? Or do I not? If you do, there's one answer. There's one solution. And it's Christ, right? Are you prepared to meet Jesus? And then here's the last thing. Are you helping other people be prepared to meet Jesus? Remember how I started out, right? Like our gut, our instinct is to apply this to ourselves and go, well, no or yes. Am I prepared? Yes or no? I don't know. But think about other people in your life as well. If your answer is yes, I'm prepared, what are you doing with that, right? Like if you know and love and submit to Jesus, think about the people in your life that God has put there that don't know him. Like think about what their eternities would look like. Like that should break our heart. When you think about them separated from God in misery and hopelessness, if it doesn't break our heart, something's wrong. Either we're cold and we don't love the way that he wants us to, or we don't really believe this, right? Or we're distracted, I guess. But something's wrong. The only thing that I can think of that's more painful than that is imagining people that I love that don't know him, separated from him forever, and I did nothing about it. I didn't help. I had the answer. I had the rescue in my hand. I closed my hand. I put it in my pocket. And I said, I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to make them uncomfortable. I don't know how they'll react. I don't know how they'll respond. That's a terrible feeling. That's a terrible thing for us to live with. And we can't force anyone. Right? We were at Prayer Partners on Friday, and one of the guys said, listen, I've been praying for and witnessing to, sharing Jesus with some people for a long, long time, and you can't force them to take the oil. It's a great point. Can't force them. Everybody makes their own decision. You make your own decision, and so do they. All we can do is offer it to them and pray that God would open up their heart to receive it. Here's how I want to end. I want to end with a video. And this video is from a 16-year-old from North High School in Akron, North High School. Her name is Prerna Subba. Prerna Subba, I think I'm saying that right. Her family were refugees from Nepal, and she came to know Jesus. And she posted, so as she came to know Jesus, she had this burden that she wanted to help her friends come to know Jesus. And so she made a video right around last Christmas, so whatever that is, nine months ago. She made a video on TikTok, and I want to show it to you.
Listen, I know you probably don't want to talk about Jesus, or when he's coming, or spreading the gospel, but I need you to stay. What if I told you Jesus was coming right after you're done watching this video? Think to yourself, are you ready when he comes? Have you spread God's word yet? If you haven't, you have to start spreading the gospel. It isn't something we could do, but something we are ordered to do. When you keep thinking to yourself, oh, I'll do it later, I'm too tired, or I don't think I have time for spreading the word, that is Satan slowly taking away your relationship with God. If you keep ignoring God, you will be ignored at the gates of heaven. Stop worrying about Jesus not loving for your past. Jesus forgets and forgives all the time. Please, do what God is telling you to do. I don't want you to be stuck in the rapture when Jesus arrives. Please share this message so we can save more lost souls.
One of Prena's teachers, I think she's a teacher at North High School, she stopped Kali and I last week between services, and she said, I want to show you this. And she showed me that, and it was, you listen to that, and you go, wow, a 16-year-old, that's inspirational. Like she had this urgency. She came to know Jesus, and she had this urgency inside of her. She didn't know how long her friends had. And so she had to do something about it. And so in her way, and it's not perfect. It's just, it's her, right? But in her own way, she shares who Jesus is. And tragically, Prena was one of the folks about 2 weeks ago who lost her life in the house fire in North Hill. And she was focused in her life on helping other people get to know Jesus. And little did she know, 9 months ago when she made that video, that her life would be cut short and she would see Jesus face to face, which is where she is now. She was a wise bridesmaid, and she was ready. As tragic as this is, she was ready, and she was prepared to meet him. And it inspires me. I hope you share this with other people. It inspires me to think she was willing to stretch herself. She was willing to step out and face ridicule and whatever it is you face in high school because she felt an urgency that her friends would come to know him too. May we learn from Prena. May her life have bearing on our life. I pray you know Jesus. I pray you have a relationship with him. I pray your eternity is sealed forever. And I pray those of us that do already, we share it with other people. That's our mission. That's what God calls us to here. Father, I pray that you would convict us where we need convicted. God, that you would affirm us where we need affirmed. God, I pray that lives like Prena's would inspire us. It's so sad. It's so sad. And yet she's with you now. She's in your very presence, the place that she wanted to be more than anywhere else. She's with you. And it was sooner than anyone thought. But God, may her legacy and our legacy last far after our lives are done here. Father, as we sing this last song, I pray you'd bring to our mind the people in our lives that you've put there that we need to talk to. Maybe today is a conviction that we need to have some conversations. Not out of compulsion, but because we love you and know you and submit to you. And we love people. Thank you, God. In Christ's name, amen.
This has been a message from the chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, Nordonia, and Medina, please go to our website at thechapel.life.